Our first poem is "But I Was Looking at the Permanent Stars" by Wilfred Owen.
So I'm just gonna read the poem first. Bugles sang, saddening the evening air, and bugles answered, sorrowful to hear. Voices of boys were by the riverside. Sleep mothered them and left the twilight sad. The shadow of the morrow weighed on men. Voices of old despondency resigned, bowed by the shadow of the morrow, slept. Dying tone of receding voices that will not return. The wailing of the high, far-traveling shells, and the deep cursing of the provoking. The monstrous anger of our taciturn guns, the majesty of the insults of their mouths.
So, going over the poem, the first stanza talks about how bugles made an announcement into the night, and then there were more bugles that responded to them.
So when I first read this, I kind of took that like a big event was happening, maybe a death. And when you think of lots of bugles, or lots of people, I thought of lots of people being honored, so I thought of a war. That's kind of what I opened with.
And then I took it like it was not a good announcement. It was when it ended the stanza with "sorrowful to hear," it was more of a negative connotation. And then the second stanza, it started out with "boys were by the riverside," and it ended with what was going to happen the next day weighed on the men. And I took the voices of the boys. That was just an ectokey for who the boys were, and then it was the boys symbolized innocence, and you're not, when you're young you don't have much worrying you, but then the men were worried about the big battle that was going to be going on the next day.
And I also thought it was interesting because it was voices of boys were by the riverside, so that's past tense talking about them, so that could be kind of symbolic of what the war would bring and stuff. But I also took that, it just really stood out to me because they were by the riverside, and then the sleep mothered them, which was a really interesting choice of diction, mothering them, and then that left the twilight sad, and then it goes on to talk about the men, what would happen the next day to the men.
The third stanza talked about the voices resigned, bowed by the shadow of the morrow, slept, and I was intrigued by the voices of the old despondency resigned. I didn't really know what that meant, and I looked it up, and it's low spirits from loss of hope or courage. So it sounds like the men are almost giving up before the battle. So they're going into it with this negative mindset of this isn't going to be good. But then you could also take it as they resigned, they're done for. So.
And I thought that the second line of the stanza, bowed by the shadow of the morrow, slept, that was very interesting, and I also kind of picked it up as they're finally giving up, especially when he straight up says resigned. But the bowed part, by the shadow of the morrow, I guess that'd be a shadow, I don't know, bowing towards the sleeping people, the shadow also gave up, everyone is just kind of, the war has torn everyone apart, and everyone's finally giving up.
And the third stanza was really particularly interesting. It has the start of the stanza and the end of the stanza both begin with an open parentheses and then just space and closed parentheses, and we took that as a symbolism for the silence of death. It's the people that were fighting the war. It is them talking. They can't talk. They're dead now because they lost the war.
And that was a really cool addition to this poem, and really helped the meaning, and I've never seen anything like that, so this poem just really stood out to me, and I thought it was extremely well written.
Yeah, and then in between the stanza it says the wailing of the traveling shells, which is the bullets that were being shot at the men, and the deep cursing of the provoking, the silence of the death, the men that died in the war.
And I thought far traveling could be taken many different ways. One of them would be the far distances between the enemies during World War I, which is when this was written, or also the fact that new technology was built and that allowed further traveling for bullets. But it could be taken a variety of ways, just because there were so many shells being fired during the war.
The last stanza, it ended out with, it talks about the monstrous angers of our taciturn guns, which the definition of taciturn is quiet, so it's kind of juxtaposed guns are loud. They make this big like banging noise when they're being shot, but then it just they're being quiet. They're not being used anymore because the people that used them are dead now. They can't be used. And then it ends up with the majesty of the insults of our mouths, which is basically saying the only thing that's eternal from this war, the only thing that's lasting, is the guns, which are inanimate. Yet the men who were fighting the war are dead now, and
that brings the monstrous anger that this stanza started out with.
Yeah.
And then that leads on to everything else, just to represent like how emotional everyone is about what has happened and the awful deaths that happened during World War One.
So that was our poetry analyzing from But I Was Looking at the Permanent Stars by Wilfred Owen.